I had no sense of going to Albania in the spring of 1989. I had no sense at all that those circumstances were going to change so rapidly, so soon.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 8, 3.
This is Radio Star Czechoslovakia, the legitimate voice of occupied Czechoslovakia.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
In early 1989, attention was being paid to Albania in England by the English media because the England football team had recently travelled to Tirana for a World Cup qualifying game. Looking for somewhere unusual to holiday, Mike Innes went on a 10-day tour to Albania. Arriving by air, he travelled by coach, staying in the hotels which catered for foreigners and favoured Communist Party members. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a written review in Apple Podcasts or share us on social media. By telling your friends, you can really help the podcast grow. It does cost money and time to produce this podcast, so I'm asking listeners to contribute $3 per month to help keep us on the air. Larger amounts are welcome too. Plus, you get that sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a monthly financial supporter of the podcast, and you bask in the warm glow of knowing you are helping preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. Mike provides us with a view of a little-known country which, although outside the Warsaw Pact, adhered to a strict version of communism and whose Marxist-Leninist government ruled Albania from 1946 to 1992. We welcome Mike to our Cold War conversation. Looking at Albania through the Cold War, it, I believe, was never part of the Warsaw Pact. Was always quite independent and was almost described as a hermit kingdom, and was ruled by Enver Hoxha, which I think is the correct pronunciation, for about 4 decades, and he died in 1985. And then it remained communist, and you visited in 1989, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. I visited in the spring of 1989. So, in other words, sort of 6 or 8 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Yeah. Right. And why did you choose to visit Albania? So the reason for that is because I just sort of started working. I'd finished college and sort of got myself a proper job and that kind of stuff. And so really for the first time, I had a little bit of money, and I thought to myself, given that this is the first sort of proper opportunity to go for a holiday somewhere, where do I really want to go? And I'd always been sort of interested in Eastern Europe. And I thought, well, what's kind of like the most Eastern, in some respects, what's the most Eastern European country I can possibly go to? And there was only one answer to that question.
What was your first stop on this trip? Was it Tirana?
Yeah. So, we flew into Tirana, and I can remember a couple of things about the airport. Three things. The first was that it was how I imagine an airfield from the 40s to be in this country, extremely limited in terms of functionality. I'm sure I'm not making up that immediately next to the runway there were either sheep or goats sort of like grazing freely. I'm sure I'm not making that up.
That does sound believable, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm so, there was pretty much nobody else there in terms of passengers. If you imagine like an arrivals hall, there was nobody else there. There was a rather desperate-looking fellow trying to get people to buy some kind of refreshments. I don't think he was very successful. The whole trip, the food was pretty woeful, and nobody was very keen on that idea at all, really. So yeah, we went from Tirana Airport into the city centre on a not notably ramshackle bus. It was fine. Through it was very sort of a rural kind of environment. The airport was out in the countryside. We went into Tirana and we stayed at the Hotel Tirana, overlooking. It's in the corner of I think it's Skanderbeg Square, which is the main square right in the middle of Tirana. The Hotel Tirana was possibly the only hotel where regular foreign guests, or if anybody at all, was doing business in Albania. That's a bit hard to imagine. But anyway, everybody stayed at the same place, basically, yeah.
Right. And can you remember coming into Tirana, what the outskirts looked like?
Yeah, I mean, apart with a few exceptions, my recollection is that the country sort of, or the urban aspects of the country were, very similar to each other. And there are some exceptions to that, which we'll come to. And that it was utterly ramshackle. Nothing seemed sort of finished. Certainly nothing kind of like seemed to work properly. And this was, this was the capital. So I think it just meant that there was more of it. It was bigger.
And what was the hotel like? I mean, were the rooms pretty grim, or
at the Hotel Tirana? No, not notably grim. I'm not saying it was massively posh, but it was perfectly fine. Not sort of special or anything, but things basically worked. I think there was a television that functioned perfectly acceptably. Would be about 99.8% sure that was imported. It was completely fine, apart from the fact that the food was a calamity. But
because you hear stories of travellers going to the Soviet Union and having to take bath plugs and things like that.
No, I don't. I don't remember anything like that. Certainly not there. Certainly not there. I mean, it was I suppose I describe it as the most conventional sort of international hotel that we stayed in on the trip.
Okay. And what did you do for money?
That's a really good question. So I can remember possibly in the sort of pre-trip communications from the company, the tour company, I'm pretty sure that they said what amounts to, don't worry too much about taking money. There's absolutely nothing to buy. One sense of caution. You don't probably cast yourself out into the depths of Europe without taking some money with you. There was nothing to buy.
Yeah.
It would have been very possible. I remember the whole trip cost about 350 quid, which was quite a lot. I mean, that was quite a lot for me at the time. As I say, it was my first. I just really started working. It was certainly the first holiday that I ever properly went on after having got a job. But probably if I'd had a budget of 370 quid, that probably would have been fine. There was literally nothing to buy.
Yeah.
So I think I got a little rug in the Hotel Tirana, in inverted commas, gift shop, more because I just wanted to buy something that was clearly a souvenir, more than I particularly wanted a rug. But it wouldn't surprise me if I paid dollars for that. There were a handful of occasions Clearly, the trip was like absolutely all inclusive in terms of meals and all of that kind of stuff. And there were a couple of occasions when I did when I can remember paying, as it were, local cash for something. But we'll come to those shortly.
Okay. And where you mentioned the Hotel Tirana overlooks Skanderberg Square, and I think that there was a statue of Enver Hoxha there, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it as I say, it's in the corner of the square, and it's immediately overlooking. People who've sort of paid attention to this kind of stuff will recall the dramatic scenes from, I think it was February '91. So. Perhaps just under 2 years after I was there, of this statue being pulled over by sort of like a raging mob of local people. Yeah, and it seemed to be ironic how easy it was for them to do that. It was physically an easy task. That seemed a bit of an eye opener in terms of, was this all it took, to bring this whole thing to an end?
Yeah, I understand there was a statue of Stalin as well in a side street.
Yeah, there was a statue of Stalin. So yeah, I think I asked about that because it was very, as you can probably imagine, it was quite striking to me to see this. It wasn't large; it was only a bust. But it was kind of like several streets away from Skanderberg Square. And I as I say, I think I asked about it. And I think the general consensus was that it had been moved. He'd been demoted over the years. But
been moved up various side streets over the years.
Well, yeah, quite. Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, this was obviously several decades after that particular fact.
Yeah. So I understand you visited the Enver Hoxha Museum. Tell us all about that.
Well, the Enver Hoxha Museum is something that I would recommend listeners to Google and to check out. I think that it's not it certainly isn't the Enver Hoxha Museum anymore. I think they've been scrabbling around trying to find a use for it. But when I was doing what I can laughingly call research for this conversation, I reminded myself that the Enver Hoxha Museum had in fact only opened in October 1988. So it had only been open for about 6 months.
Right.
And I mean, the centre of Tirana at that time was a kind of a mishmash of Italian buildings from the occupation of the 30s, the sort of the kind of Mussolini era, and sort of these tumble down Hoxha kind of constructions. The Enver Hoxha Museum was like it came down from outer space, really. I mean, it's pretty much a pyramid. It might actually be a pyramid, but it's certainly sort of roughly kind of triangular or pyramid shaped. And yeah, it just looks as if it came from another planet in terms of its position and its style when compared with other buildings within in Tirana, or indeed that I saw across the whole of the country. They must have thrown a gigantic sum of money to have produced. I'm struggling really to think of buildings that I've seen elsewhere which are like it. It's just an extraordinary thing.
And this was a museum dedicated to Enver Hoxha, I'm presuming.
100%, and the kind of deification of Hoxha, the man, the myth. I can't really remember too much about the sort of the exhibits, but it had his desk and his glasses and the outfits and the sort of uniforms he wore as a partisan and all of that, all of that kind of stuff.
I visited the Klement Gottwald Museum in Prague in the 1980s, and it sounds like it was a similar sort of setup, albeit not such a interesting building.
It's pretty it's pretty incredible. I mean, it looks rather ramshackle now. I mean, perhaps not surprisingly. A quick Google would suggest that that's the case. In 1989, it was at its shining, let's call it, best.
Yeah. I wonder what the gift shop was like.
I have no recollection of that. But what I can recall, though, is I think I probably would, I would have bought something if there had been a gift shop. What I can remember, though, and perhaps this is going to be sort of like jumping ahead slightly, I'm pretty sure it was in the evening because I remember it being dark, and there was like a ticket booth outside, and I managed to get a ticket. It wasn't like a guided trip or anything. So I suppose the broader point that I'm making is, unlike the kind of cliched views of these kinds of trips, we did have free time. We weren't with. I mean, I don't know if we were followed or anything, but we certainly weren't with the guides the whole time. And I went off and under my own steam went into this museum. It wasn't an organised thing at all. So I think that from the booth titled Biletari, which even with my limited Albanian, I was able to understand what that probably meant. And I was able to get inside. Yeah.
And when you went off, without the guide in Tirana, did you interact with any of the locals, or did you get the impression they were quite reluctant to have any dealings with foreigners, or can't you remember?
I don't think that I personally really did that. I did see other members of the tour group trying to, but I don't think that people were kind of nervous about that in the sense of, who might be watching me talking to foreigners or whatever. But they just, people, it was just an inability to communicate. I think it was more a language barrier than anything else. Yeah. Because presumably, nobody at all in Albania could particularly speak English, and clearly none of us could speak any Albanian at all. So I think it was more to do with that than anything else.
Okay, and you had another highlight in Tirana.
So this is the other kind of football bit. Perhaps for the reasons that I described at the start of the conversation, the idea of Albania and football was more uppermost in people's minds than it would normally be, and so the opportunity came. This wasn't part of the kind of like the plans for the tour. But it transpired that there was a domestic club game was on during, I'm pretty sure it was like a midweek afternoon or something like that. It was certainly in the afternoon. And a bunch of us said to the guides, we're free at this time. We've got some free time. Can we go to this game? He said, okay, I'll get some tickets and we can go. And I think about 10 of us ended up going to this game. So it was in the kind of national stadium, the Kemal Stafa Stadium, and it was a game between Dynamo Tirana and a provincial team called Beseligia from a town called, I'm going to take a crazy guess at the pronunciation, Lezhe, Lezhe. I suppose the kind of interesting thing about this was, well, okay, to talk about the game and the experience of going to a game, I suppose I like the idea of doing things like that because, going to a football match is a it's a normal thing to do in the UK, and people have a sense of what that's like to do that. And I think it's interesting when you do something which is kind of comparable in a different kind of environment, and it becomes sort of like a lens through which you can see and notice difference, which is quite an interesting thing. So I can remember that we were sitting outside in the sort of main stand. I can remember we were kind of sort of over about the halfway line, and I can remember that sort of about 10 yards to the left and 10 yards to the right of us, just standing in the stand were the cameramen. And I remember later on actually watching a proportion of the game, not all the game, was on TV a bit later when we got back to the hotel. So they sort of like broadcast an hour's highlights of it or whatever later on. A lot of soldiers in the ground, a lot of soldiers. Probably most of the people who were there were soldiers. It was very quiet. There's no supporting, no sort of chanting or whatever. No notion of, hardcore fans behind the goal or anything like that. No, it wasn't like that. It was people.
And did you were you sitting on a seat?
Yes. A sort of a bench. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Because I had a similar experience in Prague where I went to see Dukla Prague against Glasgow Rangers.
Okay.
And Dukla Prague, I think, was an army side, so there was loads of army in there, hurling various bits of Czech abuse at the Rangers fans. It was quite... But I agree with you, it's a great lens because it's something where you do have a direct point of comparison.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So no, there was no hurling of abuse. I mean, it's not. It wasn't sort of like a particularly kind of like. It didn't feel very kind of competitive. But it's worth talking about the competition in which this game, of which this game was a part. It was in a competition which they had in Albania called the Spartakiada, and the Spartakiada competitions they have their roots in the idea of sort of workers' sport, which date back to possibly the 1920s, something like that. The sort of social democratic parties in Germany and the communists in Moscow, they both had ideas about having sort of sporting and cultural festivals to effectively to rival the Olympic Games and to be able to kind of demonstrate characteristics of culture and sporting life from, if not countries that were sympathetic to social democracy and communism, then groups of people from within countries who were sympathetic to that sort of thing. So the Spartakiad competitions pre-war effectively went up to 1936 and Barcelona, and there was going to be a Spartakiad in Barcelona, but they basically didn't hold the event because of the Spanish Civil War broke out on like the day it was supposed to start or something like that. But yeah, worker sports existed as a thing, and kind of as a consequence to this kind of thing. I think it's in Prague. Isn't there an absolutely gigantic stadium in Prague?
Yeah, there is. You're right.
And I don't know very much about this kind of thing, but I believe that really that was built to host Spartakiad style events, which are effectively about mass participation rather than specifically competition. So you might have seen these sort of photographs of sort of huge displays of gymnastics and all of that kind of thing. And there were sort of cultural aspects as well. So they'd have sort of like, folk singing and chess and, lots of different things, not just sport.
Yeah.
But the idea was, as I say, it was about participation and, public health, effectively, rather than, the intrinsically right-wing notion of, the bourgeois Olympic Games.
Yeah, and also less emphasis on the individual, but rather more on the mass or the communal aspect.
Yeah. But the point about the Spartakiad is that post-war, they continued to run Spartakiad events, I think, in the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia and in Albania. Don't know why they didn't really take off in other countries. Don't know why they particularly stuck there. But I think that those were the three countries that kind of picked them up again after World War II. This game was part of the Spartakiad football competition.
Can you remember who won the game?
Dynamo Tirana won 2-0. Not terribly surprisingly, because they were one of the biggest teams in the country, and Basiligio are from out in the sticks, as demonstrated by their team bus, which I can recall, which and I feared for their safety heading back into the mountains or wherever it was whence they came, because it seemed a notably unreliable vehicle.
So where else did you visit?
I'm sure we went to the whacking big museum, which has got a mosaic, an enormous sort of socialist realist mosaic over the top of it, which is right next door to the hotel. But I can't remember anything about it at all.
But outside of Tirana, you visited some of the towns and the coastline?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So biggest other city that we went to is Durrës, and that's a port. This was another example of probably the best example of a different type of accommodation, because my recollection of that is that it was the place that we stayed in Durrës was definitely an Italian construction from the 30s. It was elegant. I would even go so far as to say that it was elegant. Yeah. Another thing that I can remember about Durrës is that it was the only place where I saw a taxi in the street. I don't remember seeing a taxi in the street in Tirana, but I did in Durrës for some reason. The cliche is that there's very little traffic, and there certainly was very little traffic. It's mainly sort of like buses that look as if they're about to kind of fall apart, and bicycles.
Right. It must have felt a bit like going back in time to some degree.
So that's right. I mean, people who were sort of better travelled and more experienced than I at that time did make remarks like, "This reminds me of Spain in the 50s," and I don't think that it was only in the sense of prior to particularly the Spanish coast becoming given over to commercial tourism. I think it was a broader point than that. But yeah, we went to a few other towns which people who are interested in Albania, who are listening, might know. Places like Berat, Vlora. I'm pretty sure that Vlora is also down on the coast, but more towards the south, more towards Greece. And Gjirokastër. And Gjirokastër is known as an attractive mountain town, and I think it's probably known as that because I think it's where Enver Hoxha was born. It's very much on. If Albania has or had a tourist map in 1989, Gjirokastër is on it. And I remember, obviously you go to the house where Enver Hoxha was born, or where he lived, or whatever, when he was a young boy, and it was framed as being a typical Albanian sort of country house. Typical being the key word there. And it looked very well to do as far as I could see. I don't know how to describe the some aspects of the rooms. They seemed as if they had sort of seating around the outside of the rooms, and and my recollection is that those rooms were typically going to be for men within an extended family to sit in and and pontificate and to smoke and that kind of thing. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
it felt like that to me. And so I suppose in that sort of situation, to kind of jump ahead to a more kind of concluding remark, it was that kind of experience where you get a sense of some of the sort of roots of Albanian culture. You feel as if you're a long way away from Western Europe.
Yeah. And did you see much evidence of propaganda when you were travelling?
Oh, that's a great question. So my main recollection of that, I think it might have been in Berat, because Berat has there's a big mountain called Tomori, which is overlooking Berat. Inevitably, I might have got these mixed up, but the details of this mixed up, but the point is the same. And I can remember looking out of a hotel window at some point at night and you could see on the hillside overlooking the town, you could see Party Enver in, lit up letters, a bit like the Hollywood kind of sign, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yes is the clear answer to your question. Yeah, I do remember propaganda, and the sort of pillbox, the famous kind of Albanian pillboxes to defend the country against an attack that never came, kind of thing. They have or had a comparable sort of propaganda value, if nothing else. But at the same time, you can laugh at the given that it's all in the past, you can kind of laugh at the crudeness of it, how unsophisticated it was. You can use propaganda, you can use that word, you can use the word propaganda to describe this kind of stuff. You're a step away from it being about brainwashing or the control of a population, or the control of an unwilling population. I'm not suggesting the population was particularly willing, but I suppose that there's a point to be made here about how I think that we can get very sort of snooty about this kind of stuff, whilst overlooking the idea that there might be things which fulfill a similar kind of function in our own society, but which we don't particularly even notice. There are campaigns in cities, growing campaigns in cities in different countries to reduce the amount of advertising within sort of cityscapes.
Did you see much? I mean, you mentioned that you didn't feel you were being followed, but was there much evidence of police or military around when you were travelling, or not?
I don't have any particular recollection of that. No, I mean, as I mentioned about there being lots of soldiers at the football, but I don't remember any kind of larger gathering of either police or military at all. Really, no.
No, it's interesting your descriptions there, because I've never been to Albania. And whilst you can see photos online, it's really interesting to hear your insights and views and your description.
Brilliant, yeah. It's. It was a long time ago now, but I'm really, really, really glad that I made that trip. It was a fascinating place to go to. Particularly, as I say, in the context of this was happening in the early part of 1989. There's this sort of odd contrast or contradiction between this kind of this sort of stability that I've just been talking about. How coming out of the Second World War, the geopolitical map was drawn up, and it did bring about a period of stability. I had no sense of going to Albania in the spring of 1989. Clearly, Albania didn't cease to exist, but the circumstances in which Albania was existing, I had no sense at all that those circumstances were going to change so rapidly, so soon. That was just impossible. There's a contradiction between that idea and the fact that it was clearly an absolutely desperately poor country, really, really grindingly poor. So I mentioned in the email that I sent to you this situation. I think it was in Gjirokastër, and our tour group were walking down the street, and there was an old boy who had some of his food shopping, and he dropped an apple in the street, and one of the other people in our party kind of picked it up and gave it back to him, and he was smiling. Oh no, thanks very much. Please, you keep it. It's my present to you, kind of thing. He was just being nice, and this, the apple was just completely rotten.
What happened to the rug? Have you still got it?
No, I don't know. So I don't know. I don't have anything. I don't even have photos. So all I have are my memories. Right. But as I kind of drew to your attention, didn't I? there's a series of photos which are on Flickr, which are clearly taken by somebody who went on the other tour.
Yeah, and we'll be sharing that link in the show notes.
Yeah.
They are really interesting photos. I bet they did bring back some memories for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, they absolutely do. They're intensely evocative, and they, as well as being, so interesting, just in terms of the subjects and the locations. And the scenes that they depict, you get that there's this unmistakable whiff of 1989, and the way that the images appear, and it's almost as if somebody has clicked a filter on Instagram, which is called
the 1980s filter.
It's the late 1980s filter. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a reminder, if one were necessary, that you can't separate the technology from the nature of your memories, because they really do go hand in hand. But there's some really tremendous photographs, and I'm pleased to have kind of, as I say, they're not mine, to be super clear. They're not my pictures, but they are fascinating. One thing I was going to mention was the kind of another odd aspect to the trip was we went down to this place called Butrint, which is very close to the Greek border, and from memory, it's known as a sort of like a place with a lot of archaeological interest, as an old Greek or Roman site. I think there's an amphitheatre there, and the Albanians at that time had done, almost no sort of excavation. It had been left since whoever it was had previously been doing some work, decades previously. But a stunningly beautiful place. I mean, the countryside is so beautiful. It would be almost silly to describe it as unspoiled, because it was unspoiled in the sense that it hadn't been discovered by sort of capitalism and capitalist tourism, but the exceedingly ugly nature of the towns was giving it a pretty good go at spoiling it. But Butrint was an amazingly beautiful place, and you could go to the sort of coast. It's very close to the coast, and there's a town called Saranda, which is on the coast there, and you can see Corfu from the sort of like the seafront there. You can actually see it, and it felt like a very long way away. Yeah, it must be, I don't know, 5 miles or something. It was just a very short distance. Yeah, I'm in this odd position of having seen Greece but never actually visited it, but having been to Albania. So
yeah. Are you tempted to visit Albania again?
I don't know. This is one of the sort of like the uncomfortable aspects of tourism, isn't it? I suppose I'm pleased that Albanian people don't. Well, I am pleased that Albanian people don't have to live such, poor in such poor conditions as they did at that time. I hope that living conditions in Tirana. I hope and assume that living conditions in Tirana are very different from how they were in 1989. But at the same time, if Tirana is more like a city in other countries, why would I particularly want to go there now?
And we have further photos, videos and information on this episode in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Don't forget, if you'd like to get one of those Cold War Conversations coasters, help keep us on the air, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. And if you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.